So, this is the case study for the Missing Booster Club funds. My name is Jenny Beach, and this is for educational finance. Category 1, problem identification. So, what do I know? I know that Mr. Stevens is the principal of a small middle school. George Washington Middle School has 450 kids. It is generally a working class neighborhood. Used to be more wealthy, and then people started to move to the suburbs. And then people now are just generally working class, and it is a lower socioeconomic than it used to be. Because of the size of the school, Mr. Stevens has limited administrative help with sporting events, during sporting events. Because of this, there's a very active PTA and parent involvement, and people man the concessions and the ticketing counters. Because of the need of these volunteers, Mr. Stevens feels he has put in place very good checks and balances to make sure that all the funds are accounted for and going where they need to be going. Mrs. Bowman is a parent volunteer that has been around for a while. She has had two previous students and one current student, Lucy, who attends George Washington Middle School. Lucy is well recognized for her excellence in cheerleading, and she is so well recognized that even over the announcements, Mr. Stevens gave her accolades, and she has been requested to go to New York for all-state cheering. Mrs. Bowman came in and requested that the PTA fund be used to help send Lucy to this all-state cheering. It would be a total of $798 that would include airfare, a hotel for Lucy and a couple other people, and food and the competition itself. Mr. Stevens very appropriately said that's not what the funds are for, and it wouldn't be fair to spend them on one student. They are actually for all students, not just one. The next time there was an encounter between Mr. Stevens and Mrs. Bowman would be at the last basketball game of the season, which was relatively close to the conversation about the PTA funds. Big turnout. Mr. Stevens is very busy with the game management. Miss Bowman is operating the counter. During the course of the night, Mr. Stevens had an encounter with Mr. DeMoss, and through the course of their conversation, Mr. DeMoss told Mr. Stevens that he had paid with a $50 bill. At the end of the night, Mr. Stevens checks everything. Concessions are in order, and there is a note indicating that the ticketing counter discarded 10 tickets because they were torn and couldn't be used. Happened to be a value of $50. Money bag, as Mr. Stevens looks through the money bag, it is absent of a $50 bill. So he starts putting the dots together, or connecting the dots, and it seems that Miss Bowman is not being very honest in this situation. What do I need to know? I need to know who was working the counter with Miss Bowman. I need to know what happened to Mr. DeMoss's $50. These are the initial, what do I need to know? Next thing I need to know is, has this ever happened before? And start running through that gamut. But let's initially get this out of the way. Problem. This is a hard one to answer, because is there money missing? Am I being judgmental? Should I assume good intent? The problem is there money missing? Is it supposed to be there, or is it not supposed to be there? And if not, where did it go? Where did the $50 bill go? I need a proposed plan of action. So first, I would apologize to the security guard and request that he come back into the building with me to be a witness. Then I would alone call the superintendent and explain what happened. After that, I would be very, very intentional about documenting everything with the security guard as a witness. I would count the money for both the concessions and the ticketing, and I would sign a receipt, and I would ask the security guard to do the same, and then I would physically take a picture of the money. So I'd have all the ones laid out and take a picture, and all the fives laid out and take a picture, and all the da-da-da-da-das all the way through. I would document what occurred from my memory of the conversation with Miss Bowman and Mr. DeMoss, and I would write down my feelings and thoughts on what was occurring right at that moment. I would then deposit the money and go home. The next day, I would find out who was working with Miss Bowman. And that shouldn't be too hard since, it's probably a pretty small district and you know everybody. Then whomever it was, I would go through these questions. Did anything out of the ordinary happen? The money seemed to be off. Were there torn tickets? Were there not torn tickets? I would tell her about my conversation with Mr. DeMoss, and I'd ask her about the $50. Of course, I'm assuming it's a her. But it might not be, it might be a him. So then, depending on how my conversation with that person went, I would call Miss Bowman and I would go through the same line of questioning, and I would also explain my conversation with the person that they worked with. So this is my breakdown of Miss Bowman's my conversation with Miss Bowman, how it would work out. So I'd straight up ask her if she took the money. Did you take the $50? If it's a yes, my questions are, should I file charges or should I not file charges? If I don't file charges, I would ask her to repay the $50 and I would no longer welcome her to volunteer when money is involved in our school. If I file charges, then I file charges and we go legal. If she says, no, I did not take the money, I would ask her what she thinks happened to the $50 of Mr. DeMoss's. Or I could scream liar in her face. Obviously, that would not be a very good decision. And I would I would look into what her explanation was, if she might be explaining something one way or another. Or I could just laugh at her explanation. Again, probably not the best course of action. So after her explanation, I could look into it and I could either find validity in her explanation and follow that where that leads, or I could find no validity. Then, unfortunately, I think the school would lose $50 and I, again, would no longer welcome her to volunteer. Essentially, she would no longer be welcome to volunteer when money is involved. I would then, as quickly as possible before any more volunteering would occur, I would create a handbook of rules for parent volunteers that clearly laid out the expectations, the current procedures, and any changes I would make to, obviously, documenting any torn tickets, keeping them for documentation, and all of that. I would have everybody who volunteered get a copy, read it, and sign a waiver of acceptance of the rules. And I would also, every time money is involved, when there's a cash box, provide a copy of the manual in the cash box. So everybody has everything laid out in front of them. And it's also a physical reminder of the rules and the double checking to have that in the cash box every single time. I would also request